Hey, it's Jess, and welcome to Becoming Heartstrong. I'm a social entrepreneur, speaker, mother, and business owner, and I'm here because I believe in you, and I want you to live your full potential. My mission with this podcast is simple: to offer you perspectives, tools, and inspiration to help you live with more courage, rebuild after setbacks, and strengthen yourself from the inside out. So each week, I talk to thought leaders, authors, experts, and everyday amazing people who share their stories and outlooks that help you get from where you are today to where you want to be tomorrow. Let's get started. Do you ever feel like you have something great inside of you, but you just aren't sure how to bring it to life? Do you ever need some clarity on how to get from where you are to where you want to be? I'm so excited to share a free guide I created just for you. This tool has helped me in my own times of struggle and doubt. It's called Your Future Self Guide. This mini course includes a future self visualization I recorded, a series of journal questions, and some insights from me about overcoming self-doubt and embracing self-leadership. You can download it for free at jessicalindberg.com/futureself. That's jessicalindberg.com/futureself. Let's get back to the show. On today's podcast, we're going to talk about something that's important for all of us, and that's being a better communicator. My guest today is Jess Goldberg, and she's a leadership communications expert, executive presence coach, and an international speaker. She's passionate about helping leaders gain clarity and confidence to make a lasting positive impact. She's taught thousands of high-powered leaders around the world from companies like Notion, Google, and Bank of America. Prior to coaching, Jess was the VP at an AI robotics company, leading a team building a voice and personality of Moxie, a robot used to teach social and emotional skills to children. She's worked in multiple industries and garnered many accolades, including 2 Emmy Awards, a Fulbright Fellowship, and a spot on the Millennial 100 list. What I think is really cool about Jess and her story is that she mastered this idea of communication and the art of communication in her career as journalist. She was a journalist for a little bit, covering stories from over 100 countries and pivotal events like the Syrian Civil War, the Ukraine crisis, and the rise of Donald Trump and more, which we could talk about in a whole other podcast, I'm sure, which would be fun too. But what I think is really cool about what Jess says, that she discovered this profound insight, and that at the heart of many world challenges lies a need for clear and compassionate communication. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Welcome to the podcast, Jess.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, I think what's so interesting about you, as I was prepping for this podcast, is that you've done some really diverse and interesting work, which has landed you where you are today. And I'm wondering if you can just tell us, like, I know you recently started a business and that you're teaching, leaders around, communication. And if you could just give us a little sense of like how you got to where you are today, because I think a lot of people in our world, but people listening are like, gosh, I have something that I'd like to do. How do I fit these different things together that I've done? So could you share a little bit about that with us?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we are saying that so many people think that our lives need to be linear, that it has to go in a very specific path, that everything has to specifically build upon each other. But it doesn't. And I think our lives are fluid and can take many different paths, and everything kind of in some way does build upon each other, but not in the way you think it does. And that's what happened for me. I really started my career as a journalist because I was really passionate and curious about understanding our world. I wanted to understand the way that humans worked better. And I wanted to figure out how can we actually make our world a better place by sharing the things that are going wrong and by finding out what we can do better about it. So that was really where it started. And it may look like there are many pivots along the way, but that's still my North Star in many ways, as I care about how do we be better as humans. And that path went from being a journalist to then moving into tech and figuring out how do we teach mental health skills at a really scalable way, to then moving into AI robotics as AI was kind of growing and figuring how do we actually use AI to amplify humans and make it better. And then moving into teaching and taking some of the skills that I was learning about how to be a great leader, how to communicate well into the corporate world and I also teach at Columbia, so teaching it to students. And all of the skills, they all build upon each other for me. And I find that the best way to find your path is really about just following your own curiosity, following the things that you want to learn. And as long as you're doing something that you feel is meaningful and that you continue to learn a little bit those skills will become relevant in whatever you end up doing. Sometimes it's really hard for us to envision what we will be 10 years from now. But if we can think about how much we've changed in the past 10 years, it's a lot. And so it's hard to envision that future right now. But if you can just envision what's the right next small step, that will take you closer to it.
I love that. I think that that is such an important insight for people to hear. What I heard you say, though, is that you had a North Star, like you had something of a mission of sorts, really, of helping people communicate better. That was the through line through everything. And I think that's the important thing to connect with is like, what's our through line, almost like our personal mission. And so that doesn't change, but the how we do it might change within different types of work. And so I love that you clarified that for people. So let's start talking about kind of where you are today and working with leaders, because I think leadership is such an interesting and important topic, and we lead in all different kinds of ways, whether it's corporately, within our families, communities, organizations that we start or run. But I think sometimes leadership feels like nebulous to people a little bit because, I think it's truly sometimes just a means to an end. It's like, I want to be a leader because you want to be better in your career. You want to make more money. You want to rise, to the next level of things. But like becoming a leader is really a skill. And to be a good leader, you need to be a good communicator. So I'm wondering, what are you noticing in leaders today? And what are people looking for? And what are they struggling with on their quest to be a leader?
Yeah, absolutely. I love this question. I think it's really beautiful. I think all of us have the capacity to be leaders. And so often we think that leadership is something that you're born with, whether you're good at those traits or you're not. Some people are meant to be leaders and some are not. But that's not true. I think everyone who wants to be a leader can. And the problem, you asked me, what trends am I seeing? Well, this is a trend that's been going on for a long time, is that most people that are, made leaders are people who are good at whatever their, individual contributors. They were great at their role, at one thing that they did in time. And people identify that they were great at that one thing and then move them into a leadership role. The problem is the skills of doing whatever that role, that responsibility that you previously were doing, and now being a leader are different skills. And I've developed this formula that I call the 8 archetypes of influence. And they're kind of 8 different skills, different hats that we need to wear as a leader in order to be great leaders. And I really believe that these are all skills that you can practice and you can get better at over time.
I love that. And we are going to link the link to these archetypes in the show notes so that you can go ahead and download those for yourself because they are really, really interesting. I actually downloaded them yesterday and I love the insights from them. So I recommend everyone listening to definitely go and do that. What do you think in working with people, like what does leadership look, sound, and feel like to those, in those roles? Like, and how do you help people get there?
Yeah. So in the beginning, leadership can feel very scary for a lot of us. It's a very vulnerable process. As we start to become leaders, the things that we struggle with become more in the spotlight. And so it can be a very vulnerable process to start to become a leader, to start to take up space, to start to express our ideas more boldly. And so it can be very vulnerable at first. But truly what we need to do over time is build our own self-confidence, build our ability to stay true to what matters most to us. And I believe the key, what's the skill about leadership? If I was to sum up all of the 8 archetypes into one kind of key thing, it's about being able to stay true to ourselves and also true to what matters to others and find that middle ground. That's really what's most important as a leader, is not just to like take our ideas and make sure that they happen, but take the ideas of everyone else around us, take what matters to us and find out how can we find this middle path that's good for everyone.
And how do you find that? Like, are you suggesting that people are asking the people they're leading? Like, are they doing research? Like, how does a leader go about finding that connection?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the archetypes I talk about is the politician archetype. And what politicians do really well, now, of course, a lot of us don't always like politicians, but one thing they do really well is before they go and run for office, a lot of them will do what's called a listening tour. So they'll go around to all the constituents before they even announce that they're running for office. and they'll figure out what matters to those constituents. And that's what you need to do as a leader. You need to think about, okay, before I need to go, shout out my message to the rooftops, let's figure out what matters to everyone else first. And yes, that starts with asking quality questions. It starts with really getting deeply curious about those around you and not asking questions to try and drive them to a specific answer, but asking truly open-ended questions, creating a safe space for people to share what actually matters to them. So that then when you are incorporating what matters to you, what the vision is of the company that you're trying to build, you're incorporating it with the things that matter to your employees. And that's going to make them far more likely to follow your lead when they feel like they are part of what you are building, when they feel like together you are building something.
So what about people who are in the leadership role who are, maybe not the ultimate boss, right? Maybe they're reporting into, the CEO or the COO or whatever. What do you think about how those people need to empower the leader? Because sometimes leaders are like a sandwich, like they're in the middle. They're in the middle of the people they're leading. So they really want to do all the things you said. They want to do the best that they can for their constituents, if you will, to use the political example. But they also aren't the ultimate decision maker. And so how important is it for the people that are above the leader, and I'm using above in air quotes, to also be equally committed to leadership? Because I think that's where a lot of things break down in our companies, in our culture, in our schools, is that we're not empowering the leaders to lead.
Yes, absolutely. And, most people are stuck in this position. Even CEOs, they often have investors. So like, even if you think that they're at the top, they might not fully. They might have someone else that they have to, go to. And so whenever we have those who are above us and those who are, below, in a sense, like in a power dynamic at play, when you're in that position, what you need to do is still be finding middle ground. You need to be the one that facilitates a level of empathy that allows the leader above you to see why they should care about their employees. The common thing that I often see is, managers who they worry that their employees are burnt out, and they think that the CEO isn't understanding. They're trying to get more done faster, faster, faster. And as that middle manager, you really need to be responsible for facilitating empathy so that the CEO understands why is it important that we, take this project off these employees' plates. And whatever you can do to tie it to the bigger picture goal is going to have you have more leverage. So for instance, if you can not just say, they're complaining and they're burnt out, but like, if we don't give them a break, many of them will leave, or this next project won't get done. How does it tie to the bigger picture goals so that the CEO can see it within perspective? And that's really important. And as that middle manager, for you to be tying the lines so that everyone can understand why it's important to care about what the other person cares about.
That's such good perspective. How important is courage in leadership? And do you see people being courageous in leadership roles today?
Absolutely. There are some people who are courageous. It can be rare, certainly, at times, because like I mentioned, being a leader is a vulnerable process. And I had to learn the hard way that like being a leader is not going to mean that you're going to be liked all the time. And as someone who has a pattern of people pleasing and wanting to be liked, that was very, very hard for me to start to learn that. But if we want to be great leaders, we have to, that's why I said it's that balance of figuring out what matters to us. What are the values that we want to stand behind? And that is very courageous to say, I'm going to stand behind this value, even if sometimes those around you don't, even if it goes against company profits, if it goes against other things. It takes someone incredibly courageous to say, I'm not going to just go after the profits. I'm going to make sure that we build a really sustainable company too. And we need more courageous leaders, because what I believe is influence compounds over time. And so what happens is if you make a short-term thing to try and, make something that's going to actually hurt your employees and it's going to go good for profits in the short term, in the long term, you're going to lose employee retention. You're going to lose the long-term people of, maybe a article might come out that's bad about you. You're going to lose that perception of customers caring about you. It might in the short term serve you well, but courage in the long term standing for what's true to you, what matters to you, will actually be far better.
So it might be really important if you're in a leadership role. I was actually had a podcast this past week with someone that talked about how important it is to have a mission, vision, and values for yourself. And it might be
Yes.
really interesting for people to have that. So it's sort of like a litmus test, right? So if something happens in the company, and in air quotes, like above and below, you mentioned the power dynamic structure. No one's above or below, but just that's how companies are organized. That so that when something happens, that you can filter this thing that happened through those mission, vision, and values to help you understand if this is like where you want to take a stand on something. And I
Yeah.
think that's a very interesting idea for people. And she mentioned that because it's like, I mean, you can just even see that in day-to-day life and family or relationships or partnerships, but even more so, I think, at work.
Yeah, I think that's really important to be able to just continue to check in of what's true to us. We have so many inputs coming in us from social media, from news, from friends, from family, from political messaging. And we often don't spend enough time checking in on what is true to me. What are the things that actually matter to me despite everything else that's going on? And the more that we can check in on that, the better that we're going to be able to, chart that career path that we want when we know what's true to us. Because sometimes it might mean that we need to take a stand. And sometimes it might mean that that organization isn't right for us. Sometimes you can't
Mhm.
change it. Sometimes you need to leave instead. And that's okay. That's not a failure. It is okay to sometimes say that this place doesn't stand within my values. I've tried and I don't actually think it's the right healthy place for me anymore.
Mhm. So I think what you're really saying is how important self-awareness is. And I really think that leadership begins with self-awareness. If I don't understand myself and lead myself, how am I going to lead others? In your experience of working with all these different companies, like, are people investing in their employees like self-awareness and growth so that they can, be better leaders or just better employees and team members?
Some companies really get it and they
Mhm.
invest and they help their employees grow. And that actually creates so much more momentum. There was so Google, they did a study to try and figure out what their best performing teams are and why their teams perform the best. And they looked at all the teams to see what are the qualities that make teams perform best. And what they found was psychological safety. And what that
Mm.
means by that is that people felt that they felt safe to express what they believed, their ideas, their innovations, and that's what actually made the teams perform the best. So some companies like Google get that if they invest in, creating self-awareness, ability to regulate ourselves, create safe space for others, a sense of emotional intelligence, that's really valuable. Other companies certainly don't. But I wish that more companies would, because it does actually increase productivity. It increases an ability for us to live better lives, for us to have better workplaces.
That is super interesting. Yeah, I think that I've never heard that before. That's very, very interesting. So you help leaders to become influential, and I think that that is something that a lot of people want to be. Like, we all want to have influence in places and areas that are important to us. And I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about how you do that, and if someone's listening and they're thinking to themselves like, "Gosh, I want to be an influential leader." What are some tips that you would have for them?
Yeah. So first, I think it helps to define what I mean by influence. Influence is the ability to change someone's belief or behavior. And that's really what we're talking about. Is we want them to change their belief or their behavior because they believe it's good for them. The best way to do that, and I use the word influence rather than persuasion, because persuasion, sometimes, you might win someone over, you might use a tactic or a logical argument that suddenly they're like, oh, fine, I agree. But then, they've got that, oh, fine, I agree attitude where they might have a little bit of resentment in it, which means that they won't always follow you. Influence, like I mentioned before, is something that compounds over time. Influence is really relationship driven. And so the one tip that I have for really being more influential is to start focusing on relationships. This is, the asking better questions. It's being able to have that ability to understand what's going on for the other person and linking it with you. Like I said before, we want to be finding that middle ground between what the other person needs? What are the things that matter most to them? So as a leader, figuring out what are the things that matter to your employees. Do they care about raises? Do they care about being praised for their work? Do they care about feeling like they can have time with their families? What are the things that matter to them? And how can you balance those with what the goals are for the company? Making sure that they get what they need. And then you also create a bigger vision and allow them to be part of something that's bigger than themselves. So that's the second tip, is how can you allow people to feel like they're part of something bigger than themselves with you? So whatever you're trying to inspire someone to do, to change their belief or behavior, it has to be for something bigger than themselves. That it's not just because of them, but what else can you get them to be part of together?
I think that's excellent advice, because as I think, and as I was listening to you, I think, yeah, I mean, we all want to be part of something bigger than ourselves. And I think we want our work, especially today, I think people want to know that they're working, they're 9 to 5, if it's that is not just about, the thing they're doing every day, but there's a bigger something that's happening. And so I think that's such wise advice. When you're in a leadership role, it's easy to have self-doubt. I mean, it is anyways, but I think, like you mentioned before, it's like people are watching you. They might not always agree with you. You're not going to please everybody. How do you help leaders, or would you suggest leaders deal with self-doubt? Is there anything that you found that's successful, or anything that you've just personally done that has helped you?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's self-doubt is just incredibly common. I mean, the higher you get up, the more self-doubt you might even have, because, you're facing criticism often. You're facing, sometimes it can be quite lonely at the top. And then there's also this dynamic that the higher up in a leadership role we go, the more we are dehumanized. It's very easy for us to dehumanize those above us, to forget that they have their own pressures, that they have their own demands, that they're not perfect. Because when we are being led by someone, we want that person to be perfect in many ways, and we put very, very high standards on them. So when we are in a leadership role, we have to remember that it's very common for people to dehumanize us, and that's okay. So we need to find ways that we can build. That's why I say we need to build relationships. We need to, make sure that we're building more of those connections. But then in terms of your other point about self-doubt, when we let some of these things start to creep in, the things that people are saying, or even just our own concerns, the best way to attack this and to look at these is to try to look at our thoughts clearly. And what I like to do is start to journal, write down what's the thought I'm thinking. I'm thinking all of my employees are going to leave me. All of my employees hate me. What are the things that you think? And then write down again what's not true about that sentence. So do all of your employees actually hate you? What's not true about that? Maybe there's one person who does still like you. Then, and this comes from cognitive behavioral therapy, then we write down a more balanced thought. We write down, okay, what's actually the truest way? We're not going to completely say that everyone loves me or everyone hates me, but what about if we can write a balanced thought? So then I would journal, some of my employees may disagree with the decision I made to, extend this project, but I'm working to build their confidence in me again through X, Y, and Z. It's okay. Figure out what's that balance. Not everything's horrible. Not everything's great. What's that more balanced thought? And that can help us combat some of the self-doubt, which tends to be in more of the extreme scenarios.
The idea of being dehumanized as a leader is really interesting. And I've never heard anybody say that, but when I think about it, it makes a ton of sense. And then, it even makes more sense why you say you have to sort of build those relationships between, on both ends, right? Between your employees and then maybe the company leadership as well. Hey there, it's Jess, and we're taking a brief pause to highlight this show's sponsor, the Heartstrong Collective. It's more than just a nonprofit. It's a social movement I founded to inspire people worldwide to embody resilience and grow through challenges. Through the Heartstrong Collective, we're dedicated to empowering caregiving families, investing in the next generation, and leaving the world just a little bit better than we found it. To learn more about our mission and how you can get involved, visit us at theheartstrong.com. how do you sort of bridge that dehumanization divide, if you will? Because it's not like you can't be like always buddy with the people that you're working for you. It's like this balance. Like and then I guess my
Yeah.
question in that is like, is vulnerability important? Like, do you want to share some things with people to make them see you as a real person? Like, how do you overcome that?
Yeah, absolutely. So vulnerability is certainly a key part of it, but not vulnerability in we're going to share our deepest trauma, our darkest wounding, our thing that
Yep.
is still very sore right now. So, a lot of, trauma therapists, they talk about it as, we share from the scar, not from the open wound. And as a
Right.
leader, I think that's a good way to think about it as well. Don't share the craziest thing that's going on in your life, the most intense, painful thing, but maybe share a little bit about why you made the decision that you did. Maybe share about the external pressures from the board that you are facing. It's okay to share the context. Sometimes I think leaders are afraid to share things that are impacting their decision because they're afraid that they just want to make sure that that everyone thinks that they had a clear understanding that, that it's just we're charging forward on this. But sometimes we have to give a little bit more nuance,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes even acknowledging, the understanding of what the employees might have wanted and why it's not that way can be helpful. Acknowledging when you've made a mistake. So say you've chosen a new project to launch for the company and it didn't go well, acknowledging that you were wrong on that. It's okay to acknowledge that we were wrong as leaders. And sometimes we're worried that people are going to, double down that like, oh, now that we've said that we were wrong, they're now all going to believe that like I'm always going to be wrong and everything. But actually the opposite is true. If we can acknowledge we were wrong, it allows employees to build that level of trust with us because they're like, okay, they see that this thing wasn't the right decision. Now let's together collaborate on the next decision.
And that humanizes the leader. Because I think
Yeah, absolutely.
we all want leaders who are honest, who will say, I actually saw I don't know, it was a poll or something once, even about politicians. It's like people respect people who change their minds, because if we're
Mhm.
growing thinking human beings, like I'm sure you can think of something, and I certainly can politically, that I've changed my mind on. That means we're critical thinkers. That means we're paying attention. So it's almost like that is something that for me personally, like endears me to someone.
Yeah, absolutely. Exactly. Being able to acknowledge our own weaknesses in the place of allowing other people to witness that will help them, humanize us a little bit more. Because if we try and put on the idea of perfection, they already see through that. They don't think we're perfect. So
Mhm.
why are we
Right.
pretending? Why are we trying to do that? Because no one's buying into that.
Mhm.
So instead, they're just going to, pinpoint all the things on us. But if we can show that, like, we understand that that's a weakness of ours, it allows us to connect a little bit. They understand they have their own weaknesses. Sometimes I wish that in the history books, when we talked about great leaders, that we understood a little bit more about their own upbringings, their own
Mhm.
stories, what happened with them, what was hard for them, why are they, a little bit complicated.
Mhm. I think that is so important, like where people come from. Kind of as an aside, we live in Illinois, and my husband and I were going to see my son run a track meet, and it's actually in the town where Abraham Lincoln did one of his first, like a courthouse where he went and practiced law. And so we were pointing that out to our kids on the way, and then my husband was like, I think he had watched the movie about Lincoln. He's like, if you think about him, he's like, he endured so much pain in his life. Like, I think his child died. I mean, he had his wife, I think, had some challenges. Like, there were so many things. And he's like, if you really think about all the things that he accomplished in our country, like, you have to look at it through the lens of someone who really was who he was. And so I think that is such a good point, that it's back to the humanization. And so that can
Yeah.
help us understand, like, if someone makes a decision that we like or doesn't like, I mean, maybe it's clear based on their personal experience. That's such a good point, Jess.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I love that example of Lincoln. That's, so rarely do we hear about all that about him.
Mhm.
People talk
Right.
about the things that he did or didn't do and what the impact has had on our country, but we don't understand who he was as a person very often. I mean, that's beautiful that that documentary was there, but think that is the exception and not the rule for what happens for leaders.
Mm-hmm. That's such good insight. So you call yourself an executive presence coach, and I've never heard of that before. So I wanted to ask you about it because I love the name and it sounds amazing. So can you tell us what that is and how you work with people in that way?
Yeah, absolutely. So I define executive presence as how people perceive you as a leader. Do they believe
Mhm.
that you have the capacity to be a leader and that you should lead them? And so, well, the 8 archetypes are the what you actually do. I have kind of another formula I call the 3 keys to executive presence. And those are confidence, wisdom, and warmth. And I deeply believe that if you have one, or 2, but not all 3, it really hinders your ability to be seen as a leader. So,
Mm.
for instance, if you have confidence and wisdom, but not warmth, people will often see you as a tyrant. Like they might in the initial kind of follow you, but in the long term, it's really hard to continue to get people to want to follow you. You know, if you have wisdom and warmth, but not confidence, which is where I find a lot of people fall into,
Mhm.
in that realm, people tend to see you as someone that they want to counsel, that they want to get advice from. They see that you're kind, they see that you're smart, but they don't see you as someone that they really believe in, that they want to follow along on if you don't have that level of confidence. So it's really
Mm.
important to kind of have all 3 of these. And when I work with individuals, we kind of, figure out which are the elements of which they are strong at that we can double down at. And then which are the things that we need to start to work on a little bit, because there's a lot of elements underneath that. Underneath confidence is how do we present ourselves? What's the stories we're showing up in? What's our body language? All of those things are really important. And then with wisdom, it's like, how do we communicate our ideas in a way that people actually see us as being the expert in the room? Because so many people struggle with actually communicating their ideas. And if you struggle with communicating your ideas, it's going to be very, very hard to get others to follow along on you. So I work a lot with leaders on figuring out their own personal style so they feel like they can show up in the room and they feel like if they want to own the room, if they have an idea they want to share, it can be shared and it will get other people to follow along on
Mhm. That is super interesting. And you mentioned confidence. You said you see, people have warmth and wisdom, but not the confidence. I think that goes back to the self-doubt that we've already talked about, but I
them.
think confidence in general and especially in leadership is challenging. What are some things that you do to help people gain confidence if they have the other two?
Yeah. So one of it is we mentioned a little bit about how do we work with those internal narratives about what we're saying to ourselves. And those, are so common and those cannot be changed overnight. Those are long-term patterns that are ingrained from us for many, many reasons. Each of us have our own stories about why we might have a certain pattern of thought. And so I work on, how do we shift these patterns of thought over time? The other thing is, looking at thoughts more clearly, one thing that always comes up is anxiety, especially when people are
Mm.
public speaking. And so I like to
Mhm.
explain about what anxiety is. Anxiety is an overestimation of a threat and an underestimation of our ability to deal with that threat. So, what do I mean by that? Especially when it comes to public speaking, when it comes to speaking in front of a group as a leader, we are overestimating how bad it will be if we say something wrong, if we stumble over our words, if someone doesn't like what we say. We overestimate how bad it will be. All my employees will leave. My boss will fire me. We go to these worst case scenarios and then we underestimate our ability to cope with that threat. So even if you did get fired, most of us will still be able to get through that. It might be difficult. It might be emotional. It might be hard. You might have to cut costs. But even in the worst case scenario, humans are very resilient. And we always kind of, our brain, when we're sometimes, trying to be in front of other people, it goes to kind of these extremes. And so I work a lot with how do we regulate ourselves? How do we work on these thoughts? And then how do you present yourself in a way that's confident? What are kind of tools, techniques, ways of self-regulation, body language exercises to help you show up and fully feel in your body more confident?
Mm. That sounds amazing. And I think that that's something so many people would love to learn from you about. I think that is especially one today that matters so much. I want to talk a little bit about your work in AI because I think that's first of all, so interesting and such a hot button today for people. And people are, some people have embraced it. Some people worry about it. Some people are, somewhere in the middle. As someone who's worked in AI, what do you think about it and how do you think about it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. It depends on what we are talking about in terms of AI. So I'll just give us a little table setting here. I think when people are talking about AI, they're thinking most commonly right now about large language models like ChatGPT. So we're using AI all the time. Google Maps is AI. It tells us where to go. People aren't as afraid of Google Maps or as, Facebook, which is also AI. It's figuring out what we click, what we like, and then recommending us things off of that. That's artificial intelligence. But the AI that people are most commonly afraid of is ChatGPT, which is a large language model. And the way I like to describe that is it's basically autocomplete on steroids. So, a lot of people get very, very afraid of AI because they think, okay, AI is going to take over my job. And that might be true, but that is also okay. And I'm going to here's why. People are going to come at me and be like, you're saying it's okay that it takes over my job? Back in the 19th century, 80% of jobs were agriculture. Now, less than 2% of jobs are agriculture. Does that mean 80% of workers now don't have jobs anymore? Do we think that picking berries is what makes us human, is what makes us valuable in the world? I doubt that very many people would say that picking berries is what makes me human, is what makes me valuable in the workplace, because that's not a job that exists anymore. So I truly believe that AI might take over tasks. It might take over responsibilities. But maybe in the future, maybe 100 years from now, people will be like, oh, it's a shame that so many people had to work at a computer writing grammatically perfect sentences. Like, that's not what makes us human. They might figure out something else. And I think that technology, as it advances, allows us to learn more and more about what makes us human. We learn that, okay, picking berries isn't what made us human. Maybe writing at a computer isn't what makes us human. There are other things that I think are uniquely human skills that are what make us human. And one of those, I have a whole list of them, but one of them is our ability to harmonize, our ability to lead other people, our ability to connect. That is something I do not believe AI will be able to do. It does not have life. It does not know what it means to grieve. It does not know what it really means to feel and have someone in our family hurting. It doesn't have that experience. And only we as humans get to have that experience with each other. And so we will need humans to be able to lead each other, to be able to connect as we continue to move on. So AI might take over some things, but there are many things it will not be able to take over.
And you call your business Distinctly Human, which I think is so cool. And I assume a nod to your time in AI. But I think that that's such a great insight. And I've thought about that too. Like, there are things that AI just can't do. And so, to your point, and the work that you're doing becomes more important, right? To have warmth and wisdom and confidence and to be a good communicator, because those are the skills that an AI robot necessarily won't have. Is that what you're thinking?
Yes, exactly. I named my business Distinctly Human because I really felt like I was sitting at the intersection of AI and human potential. And I was like, okay, what are the skills? AI is doing really well at a lot of things, but what are the things that are distinctly human, that are the skills that we need to continue to level up on? And those are the skills that I go into companies and I teach. Those are the skills that are the distinctly human skills, the ones about, leadership and empathy and harmonizing, and really big, I didn't mention this one yet, moral decision making. AI only functions based upon what inputs we give it. And this is why I think more and more people need to be using AI and understanding it, because there are going to be decisions that we're going to need to make that are going to be inputs into AI. And we want to be part of those decisions. We don't want a system that's built that's not having our input in it. So, I think about, for instance, AI systems that are already in place right now. One on Facebook. Do we want more content moderation or do we want more freedom of speech? We're putting in, as humans, we're deciding which one we want. And that's affecting all these other lives. And so it's going to be really important that humans get better at figuring out and analyzing and figuring out how do we stay true to our morals and our beliefs, and how do we make sure that we build the systems and input into the systems with those.
And so that's why it really matters who's leading those companies and what their ideas and missions are in their leadership. I mean, it all kind of really fits together. I've never thought about it
Yeah.
that way. That's
That's
really
why I said,
insightful.
path takes many different ways, but everything of my journey kind of loops in together, and each as everyone else's journeys, I think, all loop together. My path as a journalist, understanding how to advocate for the voice of the voiceless. Some of that, leads into how do we build AI systems, and leads into, how do I make sure that leaders are thinking about this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I loved the tie-in of your journalism background and the things that you talked about on your website and just in your bio. You know, and I think it's really true. It's like communication, good artful communication, compassionate communication can solve so many problems that we have in our world today, truly. Um the world is a very divided and broken place. Arguably, there's so many things that I think we all know should be better and we'd love to be better. But I think one of the things that people struggle with these days, and maybe this is a little off topic, but I think you might have some insight here, is communicating with people that we don't agree with. And we're like going into an election cycle, which, it's like almost like I want to shut off my TV and my phone until next year sometime. But the reality is that's where we're at. So how can we be better communicators with our friends and family, especially with people that maybe we don't see eye to eye with? How can we bridge that gap and maybe, kind of quiet some of this divisiveness?
Well, first I want to do just a little thought exercise with you and the listeners.
Okay.
Okay, I want you to think about your childhood. Think about all the things that have impacted your political decisions so far in your life. Like, what are your parents? Are there ways that maybe they impacted you? The school that you went to, are there ways that impacted you? The college that you went to, or there ideas that you were introduced to there? Is there ways that impacted you? Just think about all the different things that happened in your life and how it has impacted, maybe something horrible happened in your life, and that's what made you believe some sort of political opinion or something matter more to you, and you want to fight for that. Maybe you read an article at some point and something inspired you in that. What are all the different things that have impacted you? Now, imagine that many things have impacted the person sitting on the other side of you.
Mm.
And so when we are talking to someone else, we're not just, our one moment in time is not just the only thing that's impacting them. They've had this history of all these other experiences of things that have happened to them that have caused them to believe what they believe now. And so what is important to first do is, one, recognize that they have this history of experience. And two, get curious about that experience. Get curious about what makes them believe something. Because often what comes down to differences in opinions is that we are actually disagreeing on strategies and not disagreeing on the root issue. The root issue, for instance, I think about, I'll give a workplace scenario because that one's a little bit easier to deal with. But say there's a conflict between someone who is an employee and a manager, and the employee believes that the manager is micromanaging them. So this is like a difference of opinion of management style. It's different from political opinion, but I'm going to use this as a soft one just to get us into it. And the employee, if we could actually look at this, what's going on is that the manager values control. And why do they value control? Well, maybe they've had experiences in the past, some employees not performing well. Maybe it's their own anxiety. Maybe they've had perfectionism in their life, but they are valuing control. The employee maybe has some level of desire and value for autonomy. They think that they'll perform best if they are autonomous, that they are creative, and maybe they've had life experiences that they do best when they have autonomy, when they have freedom. Or maybe they had a parent who was very controlling, and so it makes them very not do well when someone is controlling them. So what we're dealing with is autonomy and control. We're not actually dealing with whether someone is a micromanager. Once we understand that it's autonomy and control, we can figure out, are there ways that we can give the manager a little bit more control? Maybe that means a Friday meeting where there's always updates. And how can we give the employee a little bit more autonomy? Maybe instead of getting Slack messages every single day about where something's at, the manager could give them a little bit more flexibility, knowing that they'll have that, set meeting of when it happens. So when we're talking about political issues, sometimes we're fighting against different mechanisms for the same issue, What is the way in which we could best go about? Can we get creative on the solution for how do we meet both people's needs? How do we meet a desire for safety that one person might have and another person's desire for freedom? And are there ways that we can better meet that? Because maybe the first thing we can do is at least just get the other person to understand that we really care about safety, that we're worried, if that maybe someone's worried that if, guns are allowed everywhere, that they're worried about the safety of their child. Can we get someone to at least just understand that I'm concerned about safety? The other person who maybe believes that actually they're worried about safety too. And that's why they want to have a gun, because they're worried about what worst case scenario could happen if someone raids their home, because maybe there was a story I once read about a woman who really wanted, who was really fighting very hard to be able to have access to guns because she was raped when she was younger. And so having a gun made her feel safe, made her feel like that would never happen to her again. So how can we at least just understand each other's perspectives? It doesn't mean that we're going to ultimately agree on the solution. But if we can understand each other's core needs, it takes us a step closer to getting there. It makes it less divisive. We can at least see each other as humans. We can at least understand why the other person wants that. And then we can work with, is there a better strategy that can actually meet both of our needs?
That's incredible advice. I hope everyone listening takes a little bit of that and just remembers the human component that you mentioned, but just that the need of the person, maybe why they have this view is because they have a deep need for X or Y or Z based on their own personal experience. And I wish that we could have more of these kinds of discussions in our world, because I think it's back to the art of communication. I mean, it bridges so many gaps. You mentioned, I think it was in your bio, that you just think that the way that we communicate and what you learned and how to communicate through your work as a journalist is so important, in the world today. And so I guess as we sort of get closer to wrapping up, what would you like to leave people with in terms of suggestions for how just in their daily life, just when we're day to day with our partners or spouses or friends or families, that we can just be a little bit better of a communicator to just maybe have a little bit more of a peaceful life?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. And with that, I will respond with asking more questions. The best thing we can do is, before we try and formulate our idea, before we try and let other people hear what we have to say, we let other people feel heard first. Because communication is two-way. It only works if what we're saying is received and understood by the other person. So why don't we start by letting them say what they need to say, us receiving it, acknowledging that we've heard it, even if we disagree, just making sure that we acknowledge that we've heard, we understand what they've said. And that will soften them a little bit to allow them to receive what we have to say.
That's beautiful. So I ask all of my guests here on the podcast, and after I do this, we'll tell you where you can find Jess and how you can get in touch with her. But I ask all my guests these two questions, so I'd love to ask them to you. What is one belief or practice that's helped you get from where you were to where you are today?
One belief or practice. There are so many. The biggest practice has been looking at my thoughts and being able to constantly remind myself to, think about things clearly. What's actually the balanced perspective here? And that having more of a balanced perspective has been the biggest and most important thing for me, especially as I've created and, shifted career paths. I've had so much imposter syndrome come up, so much fear. And for me, it's really been about, okay, how do I have the more balanced perspective and do it scared? Even if I'm still scared, I take action anyways.
I love that. I love that. And then the last question is like, what is one thing that you love about yourself because of hardships or disappointments that you've had? So it would be like, I love this about Jess because it's been built through adversity.
Ooh. I love my tenacity. And I think I've gotten a lot of no's throughout my career. A lot of people telling me I can't do what I wanted to do. I remember when I was, graduating from college and everyone told me, all of my professors except for one told me I was silly to want to think that I could move to New York and get a job there, that like no one does that. And I did anyways. I got a job in New York. I hustled and I found a way to get a job in New York. But I feel like I've gotten a lot of no's throughout my career. I've gotten a lot of no's from men who have said no to my idea and then taken my idea and pitched it as their own. And oh, did that make me mad? But
That's
it has made
infuriating.
me
Yes.
so much stronger. It's made me so much stronger in knowing where I didn't trust my idea. I didn't trust that it was good. So I wanted to get approval and pitch it to someone else. And then clearly it was so good that they took it. But it's built more assurance within myself that, I shouldn't always believe what other people say about me. And I need to trust what's true for me.
Those are great. I love those. So let's tell people where they can find you. I think you're on LinkedIn, and tell them about
Yeah.
your website and so that they can learn a little bit more about those archetypes.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can find me on LinkedIn. Follow me. I'm always sharing, free leadership tips on there. Or you can go to my website as well. Find me there. It's jess-goldberg.com. So Goldberg is Goldberg. And on my website, if you scroll down a little bit, you can, find the archetypes guide and you can download that. There's also a quiz if you want to figure out which archetype you are most like. But yeah, those two would be the best places to find me, is LinkedIn and then on my website.
Awesome. And we will link all of those in the show notes so that you can easily find them. Jess, thank you so much for spending time with me today. I think what you're doing is absolutely incredible. And I think that the impact that you're making is far beyond like the business setting. I think you're actually creating better humans through your work. And so just want to encourage you and thank you for the work and all the contributions that you're making. It was great to spend time with you today.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me on your podcast. I love that you are doing this and, spreading the word about more powerful people and like how they're making the world better and their own personal stories. I love what you're doing. And thank you so much for having me on.
It was great. Thanks. Thank you for listening to Becoming Heartstrong. I hope you found today's episode inspiring and applicable to your life. If you enjoyed the conversation, please subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, and share it with a friend. Before I go, this is just a quick reminder that I believe in you, and I believe that you too have the ability to become heartstrong. I'll chat with you soon.